In 2000, writer Philip Gourevitch lectured on the problem of point of view in political coverage. In this episode of The Vault, he discusses black and white and gray all over, some thoughts on the problems and politics of journalistic evenhandedness.
What can I say about Philip Gourevitch? This is a person who is a great moral voice and also a great storyteller. And that is a remarkable combination, who has been following events in painful parts of the world with a tremendous historical sense of what these events mean, but also a kind of painter's eye and novelist's mind for telling these stories, so that we really hear stories that so many who are writing every day and running the world every day do not hear, do not see. Everyone is grateful to him, and we're grateful to him for his coming today to talk about being a journalist in difficult places with a lot of difficult opinions to throw around. Welcome, Philip.
Thank you. I heard on the radio I was upstate driving down here today, that it's Andre Malraux's birthday, so that seems like a good occasion. So cheers to him, wherever he is. And in the meantime, the trouble goes on around the world. And I wanted to talk today. I think I must have been annoyed about something I'd read in the newspaper when I was asked to give a title for this talk, because I said that I was going to talk about problems of journalistic evenhandedness. And in some ways, I am going to talk about that. And I think really what I wanted to say about it is, or what I mean by journalistic evenhandedness, is essentially the problem when one picks up the paper and one reads about essentially a far-off crisis, usually a crisis that seems to have broken at a very high level of intensity and violence out of what, at least if one reads the newspaper, seems like a void, because it wasn't in the newspaper a few days before, or certainly no indication of that intensity. It's something one doesn't know all that well, and suddenly one is told, well, there are two sides. There are the so-and-sos and the so-and-sos, and they are fighting each other. The idea being that if they're fighting, they're either both have causes of one sort or another that are inherently, by virtue of the fact that they're fighting, of equal merit, or what I find more troubling quite often is the idea that there are two sides in a fight, or several sides in a fight, and in a sense it's the pox on all their houses view, which is by virtue of the fact that they are engaged in violence, they are all equal. And therefore that sort of all violence is created equal, and since we're all good, we know that that's bad. I know that sounds simplistic, but I'm afraid it quite often is in the way that things are covered. It actually first started to occur to me, this problem, when I was covering the Crown Heights riots here in Brooklyn. Not usually thought of as a foreign crisis zone. But at that point it was really interesting. I was living just right down here on Thompson Street, and I would take the subway from Soho to this place that was, completely walled off by police cars, and people were rioting. And I'd read in the newspapers that blacks and Jews were rioting. And I got there, and in fact, most of the blacks in the neighborhood were not rioting. No Jews were rioting. That wasn't really what the Lubavitches out there did. And a group of blacks were rioting and were stoning some of these Jewish streets and so forth. And it was really quite a nasty situation. But there was this strange piece I remember in the Times. And if you remember the way that the Crown Heights riots got triggered, a car in Rabbi Schneerson's motorcade returning from, I believe, the cemetery where he had been communing with his ancestors, ran a light, jumped a curb, hit a child who had been playing with his bicycle, a West Indian immigrant child, and killed him. And later that night, an angry mob of some young black men shouting, "Kill the Jew," surrounded and killed a rabbinical student from Australia who was visiting, who wasn't even a Hasid, but was ultra-Orthodox. And this article in the Times was talking about sort of what I call the Bridge of Saint Louis Ray story in journalism, which is, two people from such strange different backgrounds meet the same fate, brought together in the crisis of the crucible of the festering and simmering tensions in this neighborhood. And in fact, you read the article and it's like, it's not the same fate. One of them got hit by a car in what was absolutely and unambiguously an accident, and the other was lynched. But there was a great deal of difficulty in covering that story at that time, apparently, for most of the mainstream press, because lynchings were supposed to go the other way around. They weren't really used to covering or to thinking about how do you cover a lynching in which the color code is reversed? How do you essentially deal with a situation where what supposedly looks like the affluent, or, if you want to use the stupid scenario, the oppressor class. I mean, it's not as if these Lubavitches were oppressors and the others were oppressed. They were basically both marginalized groups living in this neighborhood next to each other. But sort of the oppressor class appears to be victimized by the oppressed. Later, I started to come into these kinds of problems in a rather different form in Rwanda. In Rwanda, in 1994, in the course of 100 days, 800,000 people were put to death in that very systematic state-organized genocide. The way this happened was essentially that the government of the Hutu majority, which had been the prevalent government for the preceding, basically since independence, 35 years roughly, and there was a dictatorship of the Hutu majority that set about trying to generate a mass effort to exterminate the entire Tutsi minority. The first problem that one encountered was the idea at the time that it was reported as sort of they are killing each other, Rwanda, or it would be lumped together with Burundi, which is a complicated situation. But you would have essentially a story that would say, ever since independence, Hutus and Tutsis have been locked in killing each other in political violence in this part of the world. Well, if they're killing each other, it's very different than if that would sort of like be saying the Germans and the Jews, they were always killing each other in the 40s. I mean, it really would not be that dissimilar. It would be historically no more accurate. If only it were more accurate to say that, but it wasn't. And quite often in the sense that you would see people just simply undefended non-fighters being put to death. How does one end such a thing? Invariably, one ends it through violence. It takes the use of force to stop such use of force quite a lot of the time. The outside world had decided not to go in. It was also described as chaos as opposed to organized. I mean, one sort of notices these things. And essentially you look at that scale of slaughter and you think, it cannot be chaos. There must be some level of organization behind it. It's extremely difficult to organize people to kill in any kind of large-scale fashion. And so there must be something going on here, especially when you start reading and getting a sense that it's being done in a communal fashion by neighbors against neighbors and so on. So I went to Rwanda, and by then, of course, it had been brought to an end, and it had been brought to an end, the killing, by a rebel army composed largely of Tutsi exiles, former Tutsi refugees from past political persecutions, and their children. So in other words, there had been mass migrations of Tutsis out of Rwanda, mostly into surrounding East African countries in the 50s. And by now, here were their children growing up. And although Africa has very lax refugee policies compared to ours in the West, they don't have anything like naturalization. So you can sort of cross a border and stay there indefinitely without being criminalized, but you can't vote, you can't get a citizenship, you can't go to university, you can't this and that, and you're always the Rwandans. It's almost as if you're just a new tribe in the larger national mix, but you're disempowered. So they were not able to forget that they were Rwandans, and they grew up with this dream of return, and they came back into Rwanda. And almost immediately, the story became that they were now killing Hutus, which, in fact, guess what? They were. There were a number of killings. However, they were it was clearly not an equivalent policy and or practice. It was quite large numbers, probably. Nobody really knew. It was much harder to keep track of. But there were hundreds or thousands of people being killed in the first month, largely in what appeared to be revenge killings, or were called revenge killings. Some of them were essentially vigilante justice, and some of them were actually like guerrilla warfare, because a lot of the people who were doing the fighting in Rwanda on behalf of the Hutu regime had by then immediately, I mean, there were those classic kind of pictures of boots on the road, had jumped into civilian clothes if they had ever had a uniform, or were in civilian clothes anyway. And when they're fighting, they were armed, but when they're dead, they're not. And so they are called civilians. And there was abuse as well. So you have various categories. The problem is, how is anybody supposed to make history entirely cleanly? They aren't. And I found that generally the journalistic story followed what I think of as essentially the human rights story at this time, because in the absence of any other compelling outside Western interest, there's no geopolitical interest, there's no economic interest, there's no other interest, then journalists come in and they sort of try to tot up, as human rights workers do, sort of, what's the biggest atrocity? That's the scale of the story. The story is measured, in a sense, by its atrocity. And in many cases, as I wandered around, I came to feel that was not serving either really the truth or the good, that one didn't have to cover up these killings or to cover up the fact that there was a great deal of violence by the post-genocidal government at that first period, to also acknowledge that this government, this regime, had been formed in an effort to stop a genocide, that much of the mischief that it was dealing with and much of the mischief it was making was mischief in response to a much larger problem, which was continued presence of large numbers of génocidaires, as they call them over there, who were still active and still dedicated to the ambition of exterminating the Tutsis in the country. And that most of these people who were still active were being essentially cosseted by the international humanitarian organizations and the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees as it ran this large network of camps around Rwanda, which were essentially political base camps and military training camps for the génocidaires. So it was very difficult to look at this and say, bad regime is doing, and again, it was often said, they're just the same. One heard this continuously from, well, UN people who were, of course, trying to excuse their own appalling position, and human rights workers who should have known better. And I felt quite often these two things then would feed in to the way it was reported. Now, these things are, again, in a story like Rwanda, talking about even-handedness, they're thinking about global balancing. A story like Rwanda is not reported like a story like Bosnia. It is reported fitfully and occasionally. The New York Times has essentially had a page a day on the Balkans since the last 10 years. It's a very rare day when there isn't a story of some sort, because it's our story, and because it was the journalistic story of the generation, I suppose my generation, people who got started in the early 90s. That was the big foreign story. It wasn't the American involvement to make it as important as Vietnam, but for foreign reporters, it was as important. It was where you cut your teeth, it's where you got your wounds, and it's where you got your Pulitzer Prizes, and it's where you did your good work, and it's where you got passionate. And the passion was important there. So one of the things that made some of the Bosnian coverage good was precisely that it was not even-handed. I think Roger Cohen from the New York Times distinguished himself from very early on by saying there's actually a very complex story here that needs to be sorted out, and these are not equal sides having a fight. And someone appreciated it. But we don't have anybody that we can name for Africa quite as easily as one can name Roger Cohen or John Burns or the people I'm sure at the Washington Post and at the LA Times. That is to say, people whose bylines you literally become accustomed to every day. Because people who cover Africa, for instance, Rwanda, are working on, say, the East Africa desk. And the East Africa desk of the New York Times covers, out of Nairobi, Somalia, Sudan, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Eastern Congo, Mozambique, Ethiopia and Eritrea, Djibouti, in case something happens there, and several other places that are generally having an election, a war, or both, right?
Yemen now.
Oh yeah, Yemen, right? So you name it, and you can assume, so people would say, oh, Rwanda's back in the news. It always means the news is back in Rwanda. This guy's on a scout, he sort of wanders through. And so the job is to sort of sum this thing up. And in the face of that, in the fear of getting it wrong, it's often the safest position is to fall back onto this position that is essentially a kind of simplistic idea of, well, they're doing bad things, therefore they are all equally bad. And it's tremendously comforting to us as readers, because it means if they're all equally bad, we don't have to worry about it so much. I mean, it's depressing. And we can say, my God, that poor blighted corner of the earth. But we don't have to somehow think about taking sides. And I think that's actually something that's very comfortable for people in our times. I mean, there was a time when people were interested in foreign stories precisely from the sort of, edgy, like, well, what side should we take point of view? And whether it was the Cold War, whether it was during the Spanish Civil War, whether it was during a more ideological stretch in the 20th century. I think now that's very much not the case. And I think the press, unfortunately, is serving that. One of the ways it serves that is in these foreign stories where it is really our main source of information. In other words, where there isn't a business interest that also helps inform policymakers and thinking people in the States and so on. You have tremendous coziness often gets built up in these situations, which I think anybody who's ever been to a crisis zone in the last 10, 15 years knows, between journalists and, on the one hand, humanitarians, and on the other, UN and or human rights type monitors. In other words, the people who are like us, who are there, who are from our culture, who are engaged and active, and they become sources. Quite often you will see, on the one hand, the rebel leader said, on the other hand, the government said, period. Then it'll say, da-da-da-da, the UN source said, as if that sorted it out. as if this was A, a disinterested party, and B, a wiser one, or a more perceptive one. Now, quite often a UN source is an otherwise unemployable 26-year-old French person whose country has figured out through the EU how to get a water technician's job. And it's part of the way that they try to keep, the elite happy in France, is that they keep these jobs for exporting the youth at a time of terrible unemployment. That's how humanitarianism works. It's not what it's all about, but it's how this guy got there, and how on the third day he suddenly happened to be in a town where somebody got killed, and a New York Times reporter said to him, "What do you think's going on?" And he's like, "It's terrible. It's like this and this and this." And bang, this guy's on the front page of the paper, And then you ask him, well, what, if you stumble along and you ask the same people, well, do humanitarian organizations, for instance, train their people? It was a very interesting question I started asking in Rwanda. I asked people, what were you given to read before you came here? Nothing, quite often was the answer, or very little. Depending on the organization, I don't want to generalize. Some of them were good, some of them gave reports, but some of them almost specifically said, we don't want them to come in here thinking about some historical situation. They should just be clinical and do what they do. But then they shouldn't talk to the press, perhaps. The UN source, the same thing. One would have a UN source, and the UN source is almost invariably an interested party. The UN source, at the very least, is going to try to make the UN look fairly good and make whatever it is that he's worried about, his internal fights with the UNB, to look fairly good. And he's going to tell you these things from his angle or her angle. And you have to really watch that, because I worry a lot about how we end up with a kind of consistent surrogate reporting class. These are our eyes and ears out there. These are the people that our country sends. We wouldn't feel this way about a CIA station chief. We wouldn't feel this way because we would assume he's interested. Well, why don't we assume that a UN military observer is, we don't know what his interest is, but he might have his own skewed thing. He might have a local girlfriend. He might have a this, he might have a that, whatever it is. It might not be as interesting as a CIA chief's instructions, but it might be as unfortunate, or he might just be stupid. Which is not unusual. And so you really have to look at that, and you have to look, and it's very difficult as one operates in these situations then to figure out, well, what do you do when you are the reporter? How do you back up who you are? Because there's much more of a problem in daily reporting than it is in the sort of thing I have the luxury to do as a magazine writer, which is you can sort of dig and find the things. But I think the reason that Western sources who are actually not as well informed as local sources are quoted is because they sound like they must be authoritative. There was a study done that in the first month of the Rwandan genocide, no American print media quoted Rwandan citizens by name. Think about the way that the New York Times, for instance, has this now sort of soft feature news approach where almost every story from Bosnia begins with sort of, Bogdan Slomamon on pushing his wheelbarrow down the road. And then he's forgotten about it to find out what happened. But it's, not even as window dressing did they come out with, Innocent Twagirimungu or something like this in Rwanda. They just didn't do it. So you have an anonymous, voiceless, faceless mass of people who are being killed or who are killing each other. And it's really easy to ignore it. It's a lot easier to ignore it than when they start to acquire names and faces and voices. And there's another problem which I want to talk about in the Evenhandedness, which is specific to the whole human rights question, which is the human rights question is essentially that all abuses are equal. Not that they're all equally terrible in their consequences, but that they are all equally abuses. And that therefore, the measuring stick by which human rights organizations rightly measure is that of a regime's abuses. They very rarely file a report saying, this year they only killed 138 political prisoners, and last year they killed 1,100. Or this regime only kills 1 out of every 10 of its political prisoners. Now, that is a difference. It's a difference. It's not good enough, but they may say there have been improvements, but they'll then focus on the 138, which is appropriate. That's what they're supposed to do. But again, there are two things about that that's important. One is there is a tendency by reporters these days to look at that as the most important measure of a situation that they either don't have time or don't have the kind of political will to make judgments about on any other scale. And as a consequence, it lends itself, unfortunately, in its translation into journalism, into a level where what ought to be a very important part of a larger mix becomes the priority. Is this regime abusive? What can be done about it? And more importantly, I would argue that I'm troubled by the way that journalists, who are quite often excellent reporters, and I think this is the fault of conventions rather than of the journalists themselves, end up citing UN reports and or Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International or whatever organization's reports as if they were quasi-legal documents. In other words, I go out in the field and I do my reporting. I run into somebody who's also called a reporter they filed a report for this group or that group or this NGO or that institute. Sometimes it's really, really good, and sometimes it's really, really bad. But they're much like, they might footnote, because they use footnotes in these reports, some of the journalism. Journalists quote them. A new report is an occasion for an article. These things are taken as a higher level of reporting than the newspaper itself. The New York Times would never quote the Washington Post guy if he was better, but they'll quote Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, or the UN even when they're worse. And which is quite often the case. These reporters are excellent, I should say, in the field. Most of these journalists do know, but they can't convince their editors. What am I going to say? That a Rwandan said this? That I saw it with my own eyes? Well, isn't that what they're paid for? But there is this way in which these things have this, and really it's as if it's been reported, and therefore it's true. It's been reported, and it's got the name of an organization on it. Now, when these organizations report something that turns out not to be quite so true, there's rarely an article saying, a false report was quoted by this newspaper last month. They would correct their own reporting quicker than they would correct the fact that they reported a false report. That's also, in other words, it's a safety net. It's a problem. It's one of the things I talk about when I talk about even-handedness. And the final problem, really, for me is the perception in complicated situations that the guys with the bigger guns must be worse. I mentioned earlier the idea that these stories are reported in such a way that one has the image of all death, all killing, sort of violence being equally bad. When I see a photograph of a dead person, I want a caption. Because I don't want to feel that I'm being shown a dead concentration camp guard in a pile of barbed wire, as opposed to a dead concentration camp victim, or being told that I'm supposed to feel equal about those things. And photography is the starkest form of that. It is a place where the appeal to conscience at the sight of a violently killed person is more or less the same, whatever circumstances they were killed in. And by that form, I mean, there's a very powerful picture of a drowned SS officer that I always remember. I'm not quite sure who took that, but it's sort of a classic picture of him in a trench. And it's an incredible picture, and it's incredibly powerful, and it speaks of all sorts of things about World War II, but, sorry about him. Not really. I find it an interesting picture. It's a beautiful picture. And I'm glad he's dead in that picture compared to a lot of who he killed. If you read the press, it was very interesting. The first time I flew to Rwanda, it was the 50th anniversary of D-Day. And they had the front page of the Herald Tribune every week was running the front page of the Herald Tribune from 50 years before. And it was absolutely fascinating to read this while flying past sort of Bosnia a little bit to the east while I was going south towards Rwanda, because what the front pages basically were saying was, smash the Germans, rip through Italy, get to Berlin, pave this continent and get it sorted out. Hooray, hooray, onward we march. It was absolutely clear that this was a war effort that was supported, that the papers were behind, that the reporting of it was good thing happened, we won a battle, bad thing happened, we had a setback. And in the same day's papers, the Wall Street Journal was reporting on a new poll that showed that for the first time since the war, the majority of Germans said that they thought it was a good thing they'd lost the war. Very interesting. You look at that coverage and you look at that poll 50 years apart and you think it's not unrelated. Now we're in an age when really papers think that their job is not to make judgments. And I'm not sure that's so good. And I'm not sure it's true. I think it's dishonest. When I was in Rwanda, if somebody who was carrying a machete was killed by somebody with a gun, it was considered unfair. Strangely enough, most of the people who considered it unfair were the same sort of humanitarian/human rights types who were very supportive of the war in Kosovo. In which case, suddenly, it was okay to pay the guy with the bigger guns, which was actually, to me, one of the more unsavory aspects of the war in Kosovo. I had no problem with the fact that we were finally taking action. I do have a problem with the fact that somehow, retroactively, it means that we did the right thing in Bosnia, according to the Clinton administration. But somehow there was this idea that it's okay to have the bigger guns. Yes, later people got a little grossed out when Americans started bombing Kosovar refugees because they couldn't make them out from the air, and they ran a few investigations of that. But overall, the idea was, this was a good cause, and therefore, whatever it takes. That seems to me to be not necessarily an unreasonable position, but it's certainly very inconsistent with the position one sees when one sees a guy killed with a machete by a guy with a machine gun is weaker. That's how the good prevailed to the extent that it had so far in Rwanda. It's also then becomes a problem because the disengagement of the world and the discouragement of the world. Here's the government of Rwanda. It comes in. It has brought an end to a genocide. It is using violent means. All of a sudden, the world that seemed to support it in its push against the genocide, the same sort of people who were making moral judgments on its behalf, say, wait a minute, now you're in power and you're oppressing the disempowered. And that becomes, in the absence, again, of any larger geopolitical or economic interest, the basis on which policy is made towards that government. That government becomes ostracized. Funds are cut off because a massacre takes place. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but I'm saying that's how that works. The question is there any incentive for them at a certain point, if they feel like we're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't be oppressive, might as well be. It's much more efficient. I think that there are times when this works in places that are at the margins of public attention. The failure to recognize what the larger struggle is about and to judge the events within it, not more kindly, but more complexly, in that context, actually works against the larger interest, which is presumably to shame or influence or have some leverage against potentially reasonable regimes that are being abusive. I think probably the last note that I'll end on is that probably the newspaper headlines or the newspaper stories that were bugging me at the time were from Israel, where again, the feeling is that machine guns inherently make for monsters as opposed to people, although arguably they're more precise. You can always hold somebody with a machine gun responsible. You can't always hold somebody with a rock responsible for having had such good aim that he hit what he meant to. The Israeli story was interesting to me for a different reason. Here's a story that you certainly can't complain about it not being paid enough attention to around town. Here's a story that people have pretty strong passions about and is pretty present in American life. And yet somehow it turned out to be surprising to many of the people who seem to be thinking very hard about it, presumably, that the peace process was not sincerely engaged in by many of the people in the Palestinian camp. That in fact, the peace process to a large extent seems to have been a Trojan horse for a jihad. That it was a way of trying to get as close as you could to Jerusalem. And that what was really striking is, why was it surprising? If so many reporters were there doing such a good job, why was it surprising to us that this thing blew up as fast as it did in the week before Rosh Hashanah? This gets to the sort of breaking news question of a certain kind of crisis reporting, which is the neglect of situations when they're not happening, forces you to make these snap judgments when they are. But this story was always being covered. Why was it that we didn't hear? And I think one of the places that happens is it's, again, the tendency to use sources who are too close to us and not too close to them. In covering foreign stories, it's very helpful to find out what people are saying to themselves. The Rwanda story would probably have been much better covered and if the world had paid attention to what Rwandan state radio was saying to Rwandans in the months before the genocide and had taken that very seriously. What Palestinian leaders were saying to Palestinians was, we are going to have a jihad to Jerusalem, and that's always been the consistent position of the Palestinian leadership in its own statements to them. Meanwhile, it would come to the White House and say, we're all for peace, and that would get reported, because I think people really wanted it. People really, really, really wanted it. The people who were covering the story, the people who were thinking about the story, the policymakers wanted it, some of them for their own reasons, but basically people really wanted to believe in this thing. Israelis wanted to believe in it. And I think that there was a real feeling that, nobody needs to make any excuses for Israeli policy that has obstructed peace. But one has to take into consideration that when Israel is covered here, it's covered by people who, many of them actually read the papers there, they speak the language there, and that the Israeli leadership is saying to its people what it's saying to us, because it's a democracy and it's got free press, and if it says different things, that'll get reported. So it ends up saying it to its people. And that there's a huge difference between covering that and covering a government that doesn't. And that as a consequence, it was more surprising to us in that crucial first week or 10 days where one tries to form one's own opinion, and that opinion actually does color the public debate and colors foreign policy, it's much harder to really absorb these events and to feel that one knows what's happening. You'd never think something happened out of the blue in the Middle East. You think it came from somewhere. I read the papers, it wasn't there enough. Where did it come from? What was that about? It's a broad and sort of volatile subject, but it does bring into this sort of other idea of how, as a reporter, one goes in and finds oneself quite often confronted with the fact that things aren't quite what they sounded like when one read about them. You know, the other reporters, they're very good. They're reporting it well, quite often. The stuff is there, but when you get to a place, quite often, you have to form a view that in the end, I think one of the services, and this is a thought I think I'd like to leave it on, one of the biggest services that the press can make, especially at this point, the print press, even the daily print press, because the daily print press obviously understands about itself that it's no longer the main source of news for almost anybody whose news gathering habits have been formed since 1950, let's say, or who they listen to the radio, they listen to the news, the newspapers absorb that. Part of their service is not to be so neutral as to give you an excuse to ignore something, but is to help you form judgments. And that's part of ours whenever we go to one of these things. That's why we're called correspondents. We go somewhere to correspond, to be, in a sense, a form of eyes and ears. It's not about it's about how we choose our sources, but in the end, it's about what we choose to say and see. And we're making big calls. And I think that there's something to be said for encouraging that, taking pride in that, taking responsibility for it, occasionally taking a hit for it, but that's something that in many ways is needed.
This podcast was brought to you by the New York Institute for the Humanities at NYU and the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute. You can find us on Stitcher, iTunes, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. For more information, visit us at www.nyihumanities.org.